North Africa, summer of 1942, and Sergeant Tom Harrison sat in his Matilda tank watching 90 Italian soldiers creep toward him through the shimmering desert heat, their rifles and grenades ready, confident smiles on their dusty faces because they thought they'd finally trapped one of the British metal monsters that had been terrorizing their positions for weeks. The engine rumbled beneath him, hot metal ticking in the 100-degree afternoon, and Harrison could see every detail of the advancing infantry through his vision slit. Young men, probably scared despite their numbers, clutching their weapons like lifelines as they closed the distance between themselves and the 30-ton steel beast that sat motionless in a shallow depression between two sand dunes. His gunner, Private Clark, was breathing hard beside him, asking what they should do, his voice tight with fear because everyone knew what happened when infantry got close enough to shove grenades into track wheels or climb onto the hull with explosive charges. Then Harrison did something nobody expected. He laughed. The sound echoed inside the cramped fighting compartment, loud and genuine, because in that moment Harrison realized something the Italians hadn't figured out yet. They'd made a fatal mistake by bunching up so close together, treating his tank like a wounded animal they could swarm and finish off with their bare hands. Quick thing before we continue. Hit subscribe if you want more incredible WW2 stories like this because we're building something special here and you'll want to be part of it. Harrison grabbed the reverse gear lever, shouted for Clark to get on the machine gun, and slammed his foot down on the throttle as hard as physics would allow. What happened in the next 2 minutes would become one of the most brutal and unconventional tank actions of the North African campaign, a moment where a British sergeant turned his vehicle into a weapon in ways the tank designers never imagined, crushing 23 men under his treads while laughing at the absurdity of it all. The Matilda tank weighed 37 tons when fully loaded, roughly the same as 6 adult elephants stacked together, and every ounce of that weight was concentrated onto 2 metal tracks that were designed to crush rocks, snap wooden obstacles, and grind through mud without slowing down. When Harrison threw that tank into reverse and gunned the engine, the Matilda lurched backward at about 4 miles per hour, which doesn't sound fast until you realize that's faster than most men can backpedal while carrying rifles and ammunition, especially men who weren't expecting the tank to move toward them instead of away. The Italian soldiers had been advancing in a tight semicircle, maybe 20 feet separating the tank from the closest men, and they'd bunched up even tighter as they prepared for the final rush because that's what infantry training taught them to do: concentrate your force at the moment of attack. Harrison had counted on exactly that instinct, and now it was going to kill them. The first 3 men went under the treads before they even understood what was happening, their screams cut short as 40,000 pounds of moving steel rolled over them and kept going, the tank's suspension barely registering the bump as bones shattered and bodies compressed into the sand beneath. Clark opened up with the hull-mounted machine gun at the same moment, firing in short, controlled bursts into the soldiers on the flanks who were trying to scatter, and the combination of crushing treads and chattering gunfire created a scene of absolute chaos where Italian soldiers were diving, running, throwing away their weapons, and screaming for their friends to get clear. Harrison kept his foot on the throttle, steering the reversing tank in a slow arc to catch the thickest concentration of men, and the Matilda's treads just kept grinding forward, or backward, technically, pulling in dirt and sand and anything else that got caught in their path. He could feel the impacts through the hull, dull thuds that traveled up through the metal floor and into his boots, each one marking another life that ended under his tank. The entire action lasted about 2 minutes from the moment Harrison hit the throttle to the moment the last Italian soldier disappeared over the nearest dune, running for his life. 23 men died under those treads, their bodies left scattered across 50 yards of desert sand in a pattern that looked like a grotesque trail marking the tank's backward path. The survivors didn't stop running until they were back at their own lines, and according to British intelligence reports from captured Italian soldiers later in the campaign, the story of the reversing tank spread through their units like wildfire, creating a psychological terror of British armor that went beyond normal battlefield fear. Men who hadn't been there swore they'd never let a tank get close. Officers had to threaten punishment to keep infantry from retreating whenever Matildas appeared, and the Italian High Command quietly started pulling their foot soldiers back from direct confrontation with British armor whenever possible. Harrison's decision to reverse instead of trying to break through forward was tactically brilliant for several reasons that military analysts would study after the war ended and the full reports became available. First, reversing was completely unexpected because tanks almost always charged forward in combat, using their speed and momentum to break through enemy positions, so the Italian soldiers had positioned themselves behind and beside the Matilda, leaving the rear approach relatively open. Second, tank treads are actually more effective as weapons when the vehicle is moving backward because the track pulls inward and downward at the rear, creating a kind of grinding action that's even more devastating than a forward rollover. Third, and this is something Harrison understood instinctively, the Matilda's engine was mounted in the rear, which meant that by reversing he was putting the thickest, most heavily armored part of his tank between himself and the soldiers with anti-tank grenades, essentially using the engine block as a shield while he turned his treads into instruments of death. The Italians had actually been in a pretty good position before Harrison made his move, and under normal circumstances they might have succeeded in disabling or destroying his tank within the next few minutes. They were carrying Breda Model 35 anti-tank grenades, which could penetrate about 40 millimeters of armor under ideal conditions, and several men had Boy's anti-tank rifles capable of punching through the Matilda's side armor if they could get close enough for a clean shot. The problem was that all their anti-tank training assumed the tank would either sit still or try to escape forward, giving them time to approach from the vulnerable rear and sides where they could attack the engine compartment, tracks, or thinner armor plating. Nobody had trained them for the possibility that a tank commander would deliberately reverse at full speed directly into their formation, sacrificing any chance of forward escape in exchange for turning his vehicle into a battering ram that weighed as much as a small house. British tank doctrine in North Africa emphasized mobility and firepower, but commanders like Harrison understood that sometimes the tank itself was the best weapon, not the guns mounted on it. The Matilda could fire its 2-pounder main gun and its machine guns, sure, but in close quarters against scattered infantry, those weapons had limited effectiveness because you couldn't depress the main gun low enough to hit targets right next to the tank, and machine guns had restricted firing arcs that left blind spots. The treads, though, worked everywhere all around the tank, and they never ran out of ammunition because they were powered by the same diesel engine that kept the whole vehicle running. Harrison had seen what tank treads could do to wooden obstacles and stone walls during training exercises, and he'd realized that human bodies would offer even less resistance, particularly bodies that were caught off guard and couldn't get out of the way fast enough. The psychological impact of what Harrison did went far beyond the immediate tactical victory of escaping encirclement and killing 23 enemy soldiers in the process. When word spread through the Italian ranks that a British tank commander had laughed while crushing their comrades, reversed his tank into their formation, and then driven away without a scratch on his vehicle, it created a narrative of British fearlessness and Italian inadequacy that damaged morale far more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have managed. Italian soldiers started to believe that British tankers were crazy, that they enjoyed killing, that they had tactics and weapons that couldn't be countered through normal military means, and that belief made them hesitate in future engagements, second-guess their training, and look for reasons to avoid direct confrontation. Fear is contagious in combat, and Harrison had injected a particularly virulent strain of it into enemy ranks without even meaning to because he'd just been trying to survive and had found the most effective method available in that specific moment. The laughter is what people remember most from this story, and it's worth understanding what that laughter actually meant because it wasn't the sound of a madman or someone who enjoyed killing for its own sake. Combat does strange things to human psychology, and experienced soldiers often develop dark humor as a coping mechanism for processing the horror of what they're experiencing and what they're being asked to do. When Harrison laughed, it was partly because he'd suddenly seen the solution to his problem and realized how simple and effective it was going to be, partly because the situation was absurdly perfect for his plan to work, and partly because laughing was better than screaming or freezing up or making a panic decision that would get him and his crew killed. Clark, his gunner, said later in an interview that the laughter actually helped him focus because it signaled that Harrison had a plan, that they weren't about to die, and that whatever was going to happen next would be under their control rather than the enemy's. Tom Harrison survived the North African campaign and later fought in Italy and France before the war ended in 1945, but he never did anything quite as memorable as that afternoon in the desert when he reversed his tank into 90 Italian soldiers and turned what should have been his death into one of the most one-sided tank actions in British military records. He received a commendation for his actions, though the official report described it in much more sanitized language than what actually happened, talking about effective use of available resources and tactical innovation under pressure, rather than spelling out that he deliberately crushed 23 men to death. The Italian soldiers who survived never forgot what happened, and several of them were captured later in the war and interviewed by Allied intelligence officers who wanted to understand why Italian infantry were so reluctant to engage British armor in close quarters. The answer was always some version of the same story, a tale about the tank that reversed and the commander who laughed, and how nothing in their training had prepared them for an enemy who would use his vehicle as a weapon in ways that seemed to violate every rule of tank warfare they'd been taught. By the end of the North African campaign, British forces had learned dozens of unconventional tactics for using their tanks in ways the designers never intended, but Harrison's reversing maneuver remained one of the most brutally effective examples of thinking outside doctrine and using whatever worked in the moment. The Matilda tank itself became obsolete by 1943, too slow and undergunned for the evolving nature of armored warfare, but the lesson of that day in the desert stayed relevant. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the one you're supposed to use. Sometimes survival means doing the unexpected thing, the thing that makes no sense until you're actually in that specific situation and you can see what needs to happen. And sometimes a man laughs because he's found the answer and it's terrible and perfect all at once. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault about the tank commander who reversed history and changed how soldiers thought about armored warfare. Next week we're covering the German pilot who realized too late that American fighters weren't the easy targets he'd been promised. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.